Richmond. I'm with ICF, and I'm accompanied today by my colleague Les Warner. And we also are fortunate enough to have a number of HUD, Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Home staff with us today. We have Bruce Haber, Flora Chavez, and Barrett Fisher with us, so they'll also be helping us to answer questions. So in case you've never been to one of our webinars before, what we typically do for the office hours is that we'll review our exercises. So hopefully you had an opportunity to do the homework last night. And then we'll see if there's any questions that came in the Q&A box. Remember, that's at the top of your screen. You can click on that Q&A box and type in questions. We'll answer those. And then if there's not a flood of questions coming in, Les has a number of questions that came in yesterday, and he will start to explain those and go over those answers as well. So I'm going to pull up the office hour exercises. You should be able to see that on your screen. The limitation of WebEx is, however, though, is when I scroll down my page, you're not going to see me scrolling down. So there is a gray line, a scroll bar, that you have to grab onto and move down to move down the page. So just be aware of that. If once we get to question 3 and you're thinking you're typing in, I can't see question 3, you have to move that scroll bar down for you to be able to see the rest of that page. All right, so let's get started. The first part of the questions were really to have you start to think about the lead safe housing rule as a whole, and then we have a scenario to go into. So the first question was asking how do HUD lead-based paint regulations work in tandem with the CDC and EPA? How does that work, and what are some examples? So, you know, with the CDC, HUD is using the confirmed lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter, while the CDC recently lowered their reference value to 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. And HUD's going to continue to take action for confirmed lead levels at 5 micrograms per deciliter at this time. There had been some questions yesterday. Well, are they going to lower it? Well, the answer is not right now. That could change, so you want to be watching for any notifications, but at this time, HUD is still going to continue to use the confirmed lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter, while CDC has a lower amount right now. And then with EPA, remember our regulations are working in tandem with our HUD regulations are working in tandem with the EPA regulation. So we have our Subpart A with lead safe housing rule, which is disclosure, and EPA also has a disclosure rule at Subpart F. And then we're also making sure that we are following along with EPA with their DL&Q, the lead-based paint activities rule, so that we know what kind of certifications people need to have to be able to do the type of work that we need. So for tenant-based rental assistance, we are doing paint stabilization, and that needs to be someone who's trained in RRP. So you would find that information in DL&Q for EPA, and then we're also following the RRP rule, the E&Q, renovation, repair, and painting rule. So that's where you would find more rules and requirements about RRP in there as well. And then EPA is also revising the thresholds for testing dust and paint, and HUD rules defer to EPA for those numbers. So those numbers go into effect when EP makes a change. HUD will send a notification to let you know about that. And Les had talked yesterday about some of the dust numbers changing over the past year. So we had that as part of the review that we went over yesterday too. So let's look at number 2. What projects or units must comply with lead safe housing rule and are subject to EPA and HUD enforcement actions regarding lead-based paint? So obviously this is HUD assisted housing units that are built before 1978 unless there's an exemption. And our owners and our property managers and their maintenance employees are subject to the federal enforcement actions regarding compliance with our federal lead safe housing rule. And program operators and administrators, as well as program staff, are subject to funding impacts and the cost of addressing findings if non-compliance is identified. All right, so let's look at number 3. Remember, I'm scrolling down on my page, so you want to scroll down as well. So what are the types of vendors or contractors and their qualifications that a manager or an owner should have on call? On call meaning like accessible, available to them. Well, remember for TBRA, we have to do a visual assessment. That's our way of trying to see if there's deteriorated paint. So they need to have someone who's trained as a visual assessor to be able to go and look for that. Your program staff can also have someone trained as a visual assessor. That's that free online HUD training. And then if any deteriorated paint is found, then the owner needs to hire someone who's trained in RRP as a contractor or as a firm or renovators with their workers. That's the renovation, repair, and repainting rule that needs to be followed. So we need to make sure that they have that proper type of certification. Again, it can be their staff, but they have to be RRP trained. And then clearance needs to be achieved. Clearance has to be done by someone different than who did the work. So we cannot have a conflict of interest with who did the work and then who does clearance. So it has to be a separate entity. So we need to have someone on call to be able to do clearance. Clearance can be done by a lead-based paint risk assessor. It can be done by a certified lead-based paint inspector, or if we're also doing paint stabilization, we could have a lead sampling technician do the clearance as well. So lead sampling technicians can do clearance of non-abatement work, and paint stabilization is a much lower level than abatement, so we could have a lead sampling technician do our clearance. All right, so let's look at number 4. List key steps and documents that the owner or program operator must implement to assure the units that they assist are in compliance. So first we're going to start with disclosure. So we want to make sure that there's a signed and dated disclosure form that the property owner has provided to the tenant. We want to make sure that Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home form or pamphlet has been provided. There should be some tenant instructions that are also provided for the household so they know who to contact if they see any deteriorated paint. We need to be looking, and so looking, we have to ensure that someone who's been trained in visual assessment is doing that review, that they are writing down what they saw, maybe perhaps taking photos. That could be the different documentation. And then for treating, again, if we found deteriorated paint, we want to ensure that we're following paint stabilization and that the people that are doing the paint stabilization have been trained in RRP, so we are checking the certification of that. And we're ensuring that the RRP pamphlet, that acknowledgement, if you look at the pamphlet, the back page of the RRP pamphlet is an acknowledgement that the household and the owner understand what's going on and what the risks are for having this kind of work done, what kind of safety measures are going to be put in place. So we want to see a copy that they received that RRP pamphlet. If for some reason our household needs to be relocated, we may not see that too often in TBRA, but it could occur. Was there an occupant protection plan put in place? Did temporary relocation happen? What kind of documentation is provided for that? Do we know if they went to a lead-safe unit? Do we know what kind of, were they provided any type of stipend? We'd want to see some documentation for that. Clearance would need to be achieved. So again, we would need to have someone who's certified to do clearance. That would be our risk assessor. That would be a lead-based paint inspector or a clearance technician. Then we'd want to have a copy of the clearance report. And then we're telling. So we are notifying what happened. So we have a lead hazard reduction activities notice that's going to be given within 15 days of receiving that clearance report. And if we have tenants in this unit already and new lead information has become available, they also now need a new updated disclosure notice. So that would be provided to the tenant at lease renewal. And then there's ongoing maintenance. And so the ongoing maintenance, our owner is doing a visual inspection every year. They're repairing any paint, any deteriorated paint that's found using RRP certified personnel. They're achieving clearance, again, if that's necessary, updating disclosure notices as necessary, and also requiring that the tenants notify them if they see any additional deteriorated paint. And then question 5, how do you know if your organization is ready to meet compliance? Well, you need to think about the portfolio of the work that you have. As we went through these materials yesterday, were you able to think about, oh yeah, we make sure we get a copy of that disclosure notice and put it in our file, or when we talk to the tenant, they know who they're supposed to contact, what owner or property manager, if they see deteriorated paint. We have policies and procedures that address these items. So those are some ways for you to think about and determine whether you think your organization is ready to meet compliance or not. So those are just some general questions. Let's dive into our scenario. Again, like I said, I have scrolled down to the bottom of this page. You must also scroll down as well. So we have our scenario. So we have a family who's using a housing choice voucher, and they are renting a unit in Tucker Commons, and this was built in 1950. So the family of 4 has 2 children, ages 4 and 9, and this is the first time, this is the first family using HUD assistance for a while, and the landlord can't remember if there's lead in the unit or not. So what does the public housing agency, that's going to be our grantee, or another HUD grantee, maybe this was a home voucher instead of a housing choice voucher, it's the same steps that we need to follow. What does the housing authority or the HUD grantee administrator need to ensure the landlord does to rent a lead-safe unit? Well, first we always check for exemptions. Do we think that this is exempt? And we realize, well, this was built in 1950, so no, it's not exempt. The housing is pre-1978. So the landlord needs to provide a disclosure notice, and the original is going to be kept by the landlord in their files, and they're going to provide a copy to the housing authority. So the housing authority knows that their family has properly received disclosure, and they're going to check that form. They're going to see, was it signed by the family? Was it signed before the lease or at lease closing? If there was lead in the unit, were any records shared with them? So they're going to check, and they're checking to make sure the proper form is being used. So they're looking for all those things. And then the landlord is aware there's a child under 6, so they now know that they have to follow the other lead-safe housing rule requirements. So we're going to be completing a visual assessment. So the housing authority has someone who's been trained as a visual assessor. They took that free HUD training, and they are going through and seeing the condition of the property. So this might be part of their HQS inspection that they're doing. And the inspector identifies some deteriorated paint. They saw some paint chips, some dust, and some other debris. So they wrote up, it's not an official notice, but they're documenting what they saw, and they're providing that to the landlord, and they're telling the landlord, my family can't move in here until this has been taken care of. So that's what we decided to do. We did a visual assessment. I could have an option as a housing authority to do a full risk assessment, but it's not required for tenant-based rental assistance. So we're just going to do a visual assessment. So since we found deteriorated paint, I'm telling the owner what needs to happen, and the owner's management, as part of their property management staff, they actually have certified renovators on staff. So I asked them to show me their certifications. I see that they were trained, the training is current, and we talked about paint stabilization. So they need to repair the physical defect in the substrate of the painted surface that's causing that deteriorated paint. So they're going to remove the loose paint and other materials from the surface to be treated, and they're going to apply a new protective coating on that area, and they're also going to use lead-safe work practices. So the owner staff who's properly trained is making those paint stabilization repairs, and then the owner hires a clearance inspector. So there's a lead-based paint inspector in town. He does clearances. He's not associated whatsoever with the property management firm that is dealing with our property at Tucker Commons, so there's no conflict of interest. They come in and do a clearance. It passes clearance, so we're going to put together, we get a clearance report, and we're going to put together a notice of lead hazard reduction activities, and that's going to be provided to the owner. The owner is going to have that as records to be able to attach to the disclosure notices moving forward. Now that everything has passed clearance, our family is able to move into Tucker Commons, and then every year, if our family continues to stay there for the next year, there's ongoing maintenance requirements. And so the family is going to be subject to having someone do a visual assessment that's going to come through and check to make sure there's no deteriorated paint. If anything happens during that year and paint becomes deteriorated, the family knows who to contact to let them know that this needs to be addressed. And then the as a PHA, I know that I need to coordinate with my health department on a quarterly basis. And so every quarter during this year, since I have this family has one child under the age of 6, it's still triggering that coordination. So we have a memorandum of understanding with the health department, and I am going to send every quarter a list of the addresses that I'm funding with my Section 8 vouchers to the health department, and they're going to compare that to any reported cases of elevated blood lead levels in the area. And then they'll get back to me and let me know if there's a match, so then I have to take immediate action if there was a match. So that's, in a nutshell, what we would be doing here. Les, is there any questions or anything you want to expand upon?
So there are no questions in the box. One thing I was going to mention on question number 5 about how do you know if your organization is ready to meet compliance, one of the things that we tend to suggest is using the CPD or depending on what program you are, your funding's coming from, using their monitoring, the HUD monitoring checklist. And there will be a separate monitoring checklist for the lead-safe housing rule, and just taking a look at that, because that's what HUD's going to be reviewing when they're looking at your program, and it lists out the types of records they're expecting to see in your program files for individual projects. And I think that's a good, I used to use those as a way to set up our file systems on the front end and think about, okay, we need to make sure that our program is designed in a way that we're going to have collected and held on to each of these items, so we'll be ready to be able to demonstrate that we're fully in compliance with all the requirements. So, Chris, I'm thinking maybe we'll go into a couple of the things from yesterday that makes sense to point out, but we'll remind folks that as you have questions, we encourage you to put those into the question box, and we will move back to those if we get some questions in.
Les, do you want me to keep control to be able to go to slide numbers, or do you want to do that?
Let's switch control.
Okay.
So I've got.
I can give you control.
I've written out, figured out what slide we need, and I think I can do this.
Okay. I handed it over to you.
All right. So let's see if this works. All right. So we had a number of questions yesterday that kind of were around this issue about not only disclosure, but got into this discussion about lead-free versus lead-safe. So, there was a question that came in about, I've got a building that's testing negative for lead-based paint. So, thinking that they don't need to provide the disclosure form. So I wanted to kind of go back over that and the particular terminology that's used here. So when Chris went over the lead disclosure rules yesterday, talking about that this applies to essentially all pre-1978 units, but we may have some pre-1978 units that we're able to document that they are lead-free. And so lead-free means that they have been inspected and it's been determined that there is no lead-based paint. Not that, we also use this term about lead-safe, where we have done a visual assessment, we've done a risk assessment, and we've determined that we don't have any identified lead hazards. That's different from saying the building is lead-free. When we complete our interim controls or abatement, and we've done our clearance testing, same thing with paint stabilization. When we are done, we've done our clearance test. At that point in time, that property should be lead safe because we have addressed these identified hazards, but it is not lead free. And so in those lead safe structures, we want to make sure that we continue to provide the disclosure information so those households understand, what is this about lead? Why should we be concerned? What should we be watching out for in this unit if we have some of these lead safe surfaces that maybe deteriorate over time, or maybe there's some alterations that are done. And that's part of the reason we do this ongoing maintenance, where we are doing visual assessments each time we have a turnover of that unit, or an annual basis, whichever is more frequent, because we want to make sure that those structures that aren't lead free continue to be lead safe. So that disclosure must be given for all pre-1978 units, except for these exemptions. And as Chris talked about yesterday, that really the two that we would see, I think, with tenant-based rental assistance would be where we could document that this building had been tested and was lead-free, or where we have existing tenants that have already been provided that disclosure, and there hasn't been a change in those conditions, and so we're not having to do an update to that disclosure. So I think that answers a couple of questions that was in place. And sort of a related question that we got was about asking, how long is a lead safe certification valid for? So we're going to be depending on what the subpart, the type of activity is requiring you. But for subpart M, we've talked about for ongoing maintenance that, at the point that we are moving someone into that unit, we will have done our visual assessment. We will have determined that either there are no identified hazards, or we will have done paint stabilization, done clearance testing, disclose that information to the household, and we would consider that household, that unit to be lead safe, and we would allow that household to move in. But subpart M is going to require that we have this annual visual assessment, once again, to make sure that things remain to be lead safe. So again, it's either annually or at turnover on that unit, whichever comes first on that. All right. And Chris, if you keep an eye on the Q&A box and just holler if we get questions in there. Let's see.
I will. It's a very quiet group today.
Yeah.
But please, if you have questions, please go ahead in the Q&A. That's what this time is for. We'd love to be able to answer any burning questions you have.
So we had a lot of questions yesterday, which was perfect, because I can kind of see the wheels turning on thinking about, okay, staffing-wise, who can do what task on this, that you're making sure that you either are covered or you're kind of putting a plan in place to make sure you have the folks on call, as Chris talked about in our exercise. So there were questions yesterday about can our in-house maintenance or management staff, can they test and remediate units? So under Subpart M, as we talked about in the exercise, it's a visual assessment that's done. So that needs to be done by somebody who has been certified as a visual assessor, and that's something that is free. It's online. You'd want to make sure you have that certification in place. At the point that there's any work that needs to be completed, then we have to have an RRP certified person that's going to work on that. So there were questions about, okay, so I'm certified as a supervisor, and I've got staff that are RRP certified, and wanting to know, could they do the testing to identify lead and remediate and have somebody else do the clearance? So for the testing or evaluation that is required under Subpart M, and we can kind of flip to this, no, that's not what I was looking for. Let's see. Yes. So our evaluation methodology is a visual assessment. So if you have a staff person that is trained as a visual assessor, yes, they could be completing the visual assessment and determining if there was lead hazards that needed to be addressed. If you have RRP certified staff, they could do the paint stabilization work, and we talked about, following safe work practices, making sure we have that certification in place to be able to document that. But then we had a lot of discussion about then the clearance on this. So, and this person acknowledges, hey, we get that we're going to have a separate person do the clearance testing on this. And I wanted to just talk a little bit more about, why are we making an issue about this conflict of interest? So if I'm the RRP contractor, I've done the work, the clearance test is what's going to determine whether I can be paid, whether I have to do additional work. So if I had done the work and I also was doing the sampling from that work site where I had done the work and done the cleanup in preparation for that clearance test, there's some conflict there because I want to make sure I'm going to get paid, that there won't be any delays, that I won't be required based on that testing to come back and do additional cleanup on that. And so we want to make sure that that person that is collecting the sampling and then sending it off to the lab for testing doesn't have this conflict and possible other motivations on how they do that work, where they choose to take a sample. And it reminds me of in my early days when I was monitoring, and I would go to grantees, and very early on I would say to them, okay, can you just pull, let's say, 20 files? And I noticed in one of the agencies that the person who was pulling files kind of would look and, oh, no, not that one. And I realized that there was some self-selection that was happening in those randomly selected files that I was seeing. And I realized, oh, I need to pull those files myself to make sure that I get an appropriate sampling. And it's the same sort of thing here with the clearance testing, that we want this unrelated third party to be getting those samples so that we have a good test, because this is so important to make sure that this is now a safe area for that family to reoccupy. We're doing this, we have children under the age of 6 that are at high risk, and so we want to make sure it's done properly.
So we got a couple questions that came in.
Good.
So let's see. The first one that they're asking, what would trigger the need for a risk assessment or a full lead-based paint inspection? So under TBRA, an inspection, a lead-based paint inspection or a risk assessment may be done as an option. So if the owner wants to see if the unit is lead-based paint free, they could have a lead-based paint inspection or a risk assessment conducted. That's one option, because usually, like Les said, we're doing a visual assessment. Or if you have a case of an elevated blood lead level child, then an environmental investigation would be required, and a risk assessment is part of that environmental investigation.
And I would just mention that, kind of over the years, folks have really found that a lot of times in units, there's a real mix of, lead paint, non-lead paint in that. And so if you, did your visual assessment and you identified quite a few places that were deteriorated, you're hiring an RRP certified contractor to treat those surfaces, when it could be that some of those are simply, some latex paint that's peeling. And so they could be things that your maintenance crew could actually be addressing without the RRP certification if you had tested and determined. So there may be cases where you make the determination of, let's figure out, is this lead or is this not lead, before we decide to move forward. And I would think in some communities you may have easier access. Some programs will have their own staff that are certified as a risk assessor and have easy access to XRF machines. And so particularly in those cases where it's kind of easy to do, might make sense to do. It's your choice.
Great. So another question came in asking about the coordination, the quarterly coordination with the health department, and that's the grantee's responsibility. So the Public Housing Authority, the grantee, it's not the owner's responsibility, it's the grantee's responsibility, because you're the one who knows all the addresses that you're funding your tenant-based rental assistance program through. So you need to coordinate with the health department on the quarterly basis for doing that.
And we'll go into more detail in that in the EBLL training that we mentioned and encourage folks to sign up for.
Great. And then also there was just some comments about RRP cleaning. So after you're doing your paint stabilization, the RRP contractor should be able to clean in order for that unit to be able to pass clearance. Especially if they did containment and followed good work practices, safe work practices, as long as those are in line with what they learned in the RRP class, then the unit should pass clearance. So just a little discussion going on about that. But that's all the questions.
I think when folks have where the clearance test where they don't pass it, it's typically, at least in my experience, it's not that the work itself wasn't done, but that they just haven't adequately cleaned up after that to remove all the little bits of debris that either were already there or were generated as part of the work that was done. And so that cleaning, usually the fix when you have a field clearance is they're going to go back, they're really going to do a good job of cleaning and then retest.
Great. So I will pop back in if more questions come up.
Okay. So there was a question about maximum limit in house maintenance that can remediate lead. So the issue here, when we have tenant-based rental assistance, it's going to be the owner's responsibility to pay for the RRP work that needs to be done for that paint stabilization. And so there's really not a limit on how much that would be. Now, we could have a landlord that said, I'm not doing that, and in that case, we could not continue, we could not allow that tenant using your TBRA to move into that unit. We'd have to find another unit for them. And I don't know if when folks were thinking about this, they were thinking about, do I need to try to budget for this? Or they were, under Subpart J, when we're talking about doing rehab, which is a completely different set of requirements, we do a calculation about whether we're doing interim controls versus abatement. That's not coming into play here. Our required lead hazard reduction work is paint stabilization, and it's going to be whatever the cost is to complete that. Let's see. So there was a question, and I think this is just a good sort of reminder. So there was a question, well, if we have a property that wasn't built prior to 1978, and we've got a household that includes a child that's under the age of 6, do we have to do a visual assessment? So, and we happen to have this summary sheet up, which is kind of what we need. So keep in mind that we have this for our requirements under Subpart M, that these are applying to our target housing, and our target housing is going to be units that were built prior to 1978. And so in this case, we're not having, if it's a 78 or later, we don't have this risk, we shouldn't have this risk of lead-based paint being in that unit, and so we're not required to do our disclosures, we're not required to do the visual assessment because that unit is exempt. We would be documenting in our file the age of that property. And I know in some of the other trainings we've had questions about, well, how do I determine when that unit was built? I think in most communities, if you were to look at the county auditor's records, which can be accessed online, for more recent structures, they have good records showing when that unit was constructed. Now, when you get to the 1920s and before, oftentimes they don't have really good information, but determining whether this structure was built in 1970 versus 1979, the auditor's records should be a good source on that, and I would think folks are going to want to verify the actual age of that structure when they're saying, oh, well, it's exempt because of when it was constructed. Let's see. Handles that. Talked about that. We handled that. I think talked about that. I think we, Chris, have talked about everything on the list that I kind of targeted for something that we should revisit here.
Okay, I think I saw a couple more questions come in. Somebody's asking a hypothetical scenario. A household has a child under 6 who has tested for EBLL, which was reported as required. However, the family resides in a unit that was constructed post-1978. How would this scenario be addressed? Well, remember, we're dealing with pre-78 units, so technically the lead-safe housing rule is not triggered in this scenario. However, as part of the due diligence and best practice, it is wise to refer the family to the health department to identify the possible exposure sources.
And I think that's part of the health department on the sort of environmental investigation on this, trying to figure out, and that's not that uncommon, to find that actually where that child is coming into contact with lead. Could be at a daycare center, could be at grandma's house where they're staying every day after school. But I mean, the good news is we've got a family that's in a lead-safe unit.
Right, and our HUD staff had shared some examples where there had been elevated blood level children in post-78 units saying that exposure was due to fishing lures and the vapors from melting them to make new lures. So that's how the child had become with an elevated blood level. Somebody else had also piped in last when you were talking about how to find the age of a property, that they use the county's tax assessor website. I found that that's helpful too.
That's essentially what I'm talking about. The county auditor's website, tax assessor, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So there's a question here about the RRP cleaning. The dirty cloth test is not the same as clearance. So that's right, and that's one of the things that we pointed out yesterday. One of the differences between the RRP requirements and the HUD requirements is that HUD has a higher standard for that clearance test. And so instead of doing essentially a wipe test that the contractor themselves could be doing, we're using a third-party tester that's then going to be collecting samples and sending them off to a lab. So we do have a higher threshold for our clearance testing. And sometimes being clear on the scope of work with contractors, and going over that, because we will have RRP certified contractors that are generally not working with HUD funds, and so may not be up to speed on some of those key differences. Like we talked about, there were differences in the de minimis standards between the HUD and the RRP rule.
Let's maybe pull up that handout. It's at the far right at the top. You need to click on that little caret to see other handouts. It's the last handout listed.
Yep, there we go. I want to say it's the second page on this. Yeah. So yeah, under this confirmatory testing at the bottom here, is pointing out the difference between the EPA and the HUD standard on this. And then I'll just note, as we talked about on this same handout, the difference between the safe work practices for EPA versus HUD. So we have some key differences between these two sets of regulations. And in these instances, HUD is more stringent. Trying to see if there is still that. Chris, I think that's everything in the Q&A also.
Okay.
Do we want to mention about the other sessions in the series? Let me see if I can pull up.
Yeah, they're on the slides.
Yeah, I'm flipping to see which. Looks like it's 12.
And then there's one at the end, too, for EBLL.
Yeah, so we just wanted to mention, so this was the office hour for Subpart M, but there's also a session for project-based assistance and also for public housing that you, depending on the types of activities that your agency is funding, that may be something you'll also want to sign up for. And then, just trying to flip to, let's see.
I think 108 maybe, 107. There we go.
Here's the EBLL. So Chris did an amazing job of trying to compress a much longer training on EBLL and the required steps on that. But I think for folks that would potentially be responsible for a compliant response on that, I think you need to attend that longer session. Someone from your agency needs to be up to speed on that, and so I would really highly recommend that you do that. And one of the things that Chris was pointing out in there was a particular slide that walked through the steps and also included the timelines on this, is that there's some pretty stringent turnaround times on responding to EBLL. So I think it would be important not only to know what those requirements were, but also to kind of have a plan of action, have thought about having the capacity to be able to do that in advance. Because I don't think it would be very difficult to meet these requirements without, having planned ahead on this.
And Les, can you go to slide 93, because somebody was asking is there a link to the EBL training? So there's a recorded training up there on slide 93. The new training session, I'm sorry, I did misread the question. They were asking about the new training session. The registration, I think, is going to go out next week. I was reviewing some marketing announcements about it this week. Our HUD clients need to approve that, and then we'll send out the registration. So watch for it. It'll probably go out next week, if not the week after, but you can save the date since you know what the upcoming date's going to be, but still register. It should come through the HUD Exchange. So the way that you found out about this class will be the same way. Yes, thank you. And if you have not already submitted your information to the mailing list, this is how we send out information and updates about lead-safe housing and healthy homes. So please get yourself on the mailing list and you'll be one of the first to find out about upcoming new events that are on there. Okay, somebody's asking, Les, do you want to take this one on? Do you need to get clearance testing anytime lead-based paint is disturbed?
Yeah, so we're always going to need to have a clearance test because we're wanting to make sure that it's going to be lead safe for that household and that child that's under the age of 6 that's at high risk to be able to occupy that space. So yeah, we're always having a requirement for clearance testing to be done, and we're going to include that information then in the disclosures that go to that household.
What if it's below de minimis?
I would.
Do you want to go to those slides? I think they were at the beginning.
Try to see if we have a number on that.
We were at the beginning of your area. I'm looking.
Maybe.
Yeah. Look at slide 22.
Okay. Yeah, so here are de minimis requirements, but I guess, Chris, I would think that a clearance test is still required.
Maybe one of our HUD staff can.
Here we go. Okay, so Bruce is luckily weighing in here. So if it is under that de minimis level, then clearance is not required. But if it exceeds that, then it's greater than the de minimis, then clearance would be required.
And de minimis is a measurement, a space measurement. So that's when we talk about de minimis. And so you need to look at, are you interior, exterior, a small component type like a part of a railing or something that's what needs to be reviewed to determine if it's larger than de minimis, then it does trigger, and if it's smaller than de minimis, then it would not trigger.
So there's a question just came in. Are there any requirements for clearance testing or other documentation for exterior paint stabilization? Yeah, exterior follows the same protocol other than we have the de minimis rule for exterior on 20 square feet. So anything above that is going to have clearance testing. We're going to be doing paint stabilization on that and then having clearance testing done. And again, our point is to try to make sure that this is going to create a safe environment for that household.
Yeah, and then just to highlight on this slide here, that note about HUD de minimis levels are more protective than EPA RRP guidelines because the interior is 2 square feet. And what's the EPA one? Is it 6?
I believe it's 6.
Yeah, so it's more restrictive for the lead safe housing rule.
Well, not seeing any additional questions. I think we can end today's session. Again, we encourage you to access any of the other in this series that would be applicable, to also consider having someone attend the EBLL training, and then also, using these resources that are posted that we went through as part of the resource list, I think will be very helpful to folks. So thanks everybody for your attention as part of this. Chris, any last?
There was a couple last questions that came in. Somebody was saying for exterior work, where is clearance testing done? And it's saying exterior clearance consists of a visual assessment of the work area. There is no dust testing if the interiors were sealed to prevent dust entering, because they said if the work was done outside, do I still need to do clearance of the tenant's unit? But if the work area was outside and everything was sealed to prevent dust entering, then the exterior would just have that testing done. And somebody's asking, I thought all TBRA agencies had to ask property owners for any additional units that are federally funded and also meeting other lead-based paint requirements. That's really in relation to EBLL. So where's my EBLL summary slide? We could pull up real quick. Can you pull up 92?
Sure.
Yes. This is, if you're like halfway down the page, it'll say risk assessment and lead hazard control on other coverage units. And so I mentioned yesterday, other coverage units are units that are also receiving some other type of federal assistance. And with TBRA, it's really tricky because you may not know, you only know what your program is funding. You might not know that there's another program that's also funding a household in that same property. And so that's why you really need to coordinate with the owner to find out, are there other HUD-assisted units in this property, because those would need to have a risk assessment done if the unit that the EBLL child is residing in is found to have lead-based paint. So that's when you would need to talk to the owner to find out about the other unit. So that's one step. There's also separate and apart from this, that coordination with the health department, where you are sharing with the health department households that you are funding with TBRA, but you wouldn't know what other agencies are doing because you're coordinating with the health department one-on-one with that. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes, and then they're asking about exterior clearance. Does the visual assessment still need to be done by a third party? And the answer is yes. If you're ever thinking of clearance, third party is always the right answer. So clearance under the Lead Safe Housing Rule is performed by a third party who is a certified inspector, risk assessor, or if you're doing non-abatement work, can also be a clearance technician.
Which is why we kind of mentioned about in planning, thinking about having that capacity in advance of when you need it, and particularly since if it is an agency themselves, you're going to have to go through a procurement process. A private owner of a property would not be triggering federal procurement, but you as an agency, so that that a little bit of a time delay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think now we've gotten all the questions. So if you go to, was it our last slide or one of our second to last slides that had the email on it, maybe 106 or 107, maybe the slide before this. There at the very bottom. So we try to answer your questions as best as we can. There are so many resources out there, but if you ever find yourself stuck, you can always send an email to the Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes. That's what OLHCHH stands for, and they are more than willing and able to help answer your question or point you in the right direction of where you can find additional resources. Thank you for your time today. Thank you so much for our HUD staff. We had Karen Griego and Flora Chavez and Barrett Fisher and Bruce Haber on with us today. Thank you to Sharita Clay for our host, and to you, Les, for always providing great explanations on all these questions. So appreciate everybody's time today, and Les and I will see you at some future training in the future. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.